September the 1st, 1939. Before the sun set on that day, the world had begun its descent into the deadliest war in human history. 6 years later, more than 60 million people were dead. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and the course of history had been changed forever. This is the complete true story of World War II. The First World War ended on November the 11th, 1918. But peace did not bring stability. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins. Millions of families mourned their dead, and entire economies struggled to recover from 4 years of unprecedented destruction. Although the guns had fallen silent, the wounds of war remained open. The conflict had claimed the lives of more than 20 million people, making it one of the deadliest wars in human history up to that time. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, had collapsed, leaving behind political instability, economic hardship, and millions searching for a new future. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers gathered outside Paris to negotiate a lasting peace. Their negotiations produced the Treaty of Versailles, an agreement that would shape Europe's future for decades to come. Under its terms, Germany was required to accept responsibility for the war, surrender territory, sharply reduce the size of its military, and pay enormous financial reparations. To many Allied leaders, these measures were intended to prevent another global conflict. But inside Germany, the treaty was widely viewed as a national humiliation. Many Germans believed they had been unfairly blamed for the war and forced to endure conditions that crippled their economy and wounded their national pride. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Germany faced economic turmoil. Hyperinflation devastated savings, and later the Great Depression brought widespread unemployment, fueling public anger. Confidence in democratic institutions weakened, while extremist political movements promised strength, revenge, and national renewal. Few realized that the peace established after the First World War was dangerously fragile. Beneath the surface, resentment, economic instability, and political division were quietly laying the foundation for an even greater catastrophe. The First World War had ended, but the road to the Second World War had already begun. As Germany sank deeper into political instability and economic hardship, millions of people lost faith in the future. In that climate of fear, uncertainty, and frustration, a little-known political figure named Adolf Hitler began attracting national attention. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler served as a soldier in the German army during the First World War. Like many Germans, he was deeply angered by Germany's defeat and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He embraced the false stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that Germany had been betrayed from within rather than defeated on the battlefield, a narrative that historians reject, but one that resonated with many Germans struggling to understand the nation's collapse. In 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, a small political movement in Munich. His powerful public speaking and ability to connect with frustrated audiences quickly made him one of the party's most influential members. The following year, the organization was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Hitler's speeches focused on restoring Germany's strength, overturning the Treaty of Versailles, and rebuilding the nation's economy. At the same time, he promoted dangerous ideas rooted in extreme nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarian rule. He blamed Germany's problems on political opponents, Jewish communities, and other groups,
claims that had no factual basis, but gained support among some desperate citizens during years of crisis.
In 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power by force in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed, and he was arrested and sentenced to prison. While imprisoned, he wrote much of Mein Kampf. In its pages, Hitler openly described his vision of dictatorship, territorial expansion, racial ideology, and anti-Semitism. In hindsight, historians regard the book as a clear warning of the policies he would later put into action. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, devastated Germany's economy. As unemployment soared and public confidence collapsed, support for the Nazi Party grew rapidly. Hitler increasingly presented himself as the leader who could restore Germany's economy, stability, and national pride. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many conservative politicians believed they could control him. They were disastrously mistaken. Within months, democratic institutions were dismantled, political opponents were silenced, and Germany was transformed into a dictatorship. The world had not yet realized it, but one of history's darkest chapters had already begun. By the late 1930s, Europe stood at a dangerous crossroads. Adolf Hitler had transformed Germany into a dictatorship, rebuilt its military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and openly challenged the post-war order. Yet, despite the warning signs, many European leaders still hoped another catastrophic war could be avoided. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. The move violated international agreements, but neither France nor Britain responded with military force. Hitler later admitted that if German troops had been challenged, they would likely have been forced to withdraw. 2 years later, in March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. The takeover occurred without significant military resistance, and Germany's borders expanded once again. Later that year, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding control of the Sudetenland, a border region with a large ethnic German population. Hoping to preserve peace, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met at the Munich Conference in September 1938. Without Czechoslovakia present at the negotiating table, the four powers agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland. Returning to Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared that the agreement had secured peace for our time. For many, it seemed that another world war had been avoided. The optimism would not last. In March 1939, Germany broke its promises and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It became clear that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond uniting ethnic Germans or revising the Treaty of Versailles. His goal was the expansion of German power across Europe. The occupation shocked governments across the continent. The policy of appeasement, making concessions in the hope of avoiding war, rapidly lost support. Britain and France pledged to defend Poland if it came under attack, recognizing that another act of aggression could no longer go unanswered. Meanwhile, Germany accelerated its military preparations. Across Europe, nations strengthened their armed forces, expanded defensive positions, and prepared for the possibility of another continental war. Diplomacy was rapidly giving way to confrontation. Europe had reached the brink of war. The next move would determine the fate of an entire continent. At dawn on September the 1st, 1939, the answer arrived. At dawn on September the 1st, 1939, the answer arrived. Without a formal declaration of war, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, unleashing a conflict that would soon engulf the entire world. What had been feared for years was now becoming reality. The invasion began with one of the war's first military engagements, when the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish military outpost at Westerplatte, near the city of Danzig. At the same time, German forces crossed the Polish border from multiple directions, launching a carefully coordinated offensive. The attack relied on a new style of warfare that became known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Rather than fighting a slow war of attrition like the First World War, Germany combined fast-moving armoured divisions, motorised infantry, artillery, and the Luftwaffe into a single, highly coordinated assault. The goal was simple: overwhelm the enemy before an organised defence could be established. The speed of the attack caught Poland by surprise. German tanks broke through defensive lines, while aircraft bombed military targets, railway networks, bridges, and communication centres. The rapid advance disrupted Poland's ability to coordinate its defences. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, the Polish army resisted with determination. Soldiers fought fiercely in battles across the country, and civilians found themselves caught in the rapidly expanding conflict. Entire communities were forced to flee as the front lines moved closer each day. On September 3rd, 1939, after Germany ignored their ultimatum to withdraw from Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Their declarations marked the official beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Yet Poland's ordeal was far from over. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east under the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Trapped between two invading armies, Poland faced an impossible struggle. By early October 1939, organized Polish resistance had largely ended. The country was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, while millions of Polish civilians suddenly found themselves living under foreign occupation. The invasion of Poland demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of modern mechanized warfare. It also revealed that the conflict would not remain limited to one nation. The war had begun. Soon, it would spread across an entire continent. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the Second World War. But after the initial fighting ended, an uneasy silence settled across much of Western Europe. For nearly 8 months, from September 1939 to May 1940, Britain and France remained officially at war with Germany. Yet little major fighting took place along the Western Front. Newspapers called it the Phony War, while the French referred to it as the Drôle de Guerre, or the Strange War. Behind the quiet, however, both sides were preparing for a far larger conflict. That silence ended on April the 9th, 1940. When Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within hours, while fighting in Norway continued for nearly 2 months before Allied forces withdrew. Control of Norway secured vital shipping routes and access to Swedish iron ore, resources considered essential to Germany's war effort. Just 1 month later, on May 10, 1940, Germany struck again. German forces invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, bypassing much of France's heavily fortified Maginot Line. Instead of launching a direct assault against France's strongest defences, German armoured divisions advanced through the densely forested Ardennes,
a region many Allied commanders believed was unsuitable for a large-scale attack. The gamble succeeded.
German panzer divisions broke through Allied lines with remarkable speed. Supported by coordinated air attacks from the Luftwaffe, they advanced deep into France, cutting off British and French forces before they could reorganize. Once again, Blitzkrieg demonstrated how speed, surprise, and coordination could overwhelm even experienced armies. As German forces pushed toward the English Channel, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers became trapped near the French port of Dunkirk. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, one of the most remarkable evacuation efforts in military history. Naval vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, and hundreds of civilian craft crossed the English Channel under constant air attack. Against overwhelming odds, more than 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated to Britain. Although Dunkirk was a strategic retreat rather than a military victory, the successful evacuation preserved much of Britain's trained army and allowed the fight against Nazi Germany to continue. Meanwhile, the situation in France grew increasingly desperate. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered Paris without major resistance. Just over a week later, France signed an armistice with Germany. Northern and Western France came under German occupation, while the collaborationist Vichy government was established in the south. In less than 2 months, one of Europe's most powerful military nations had fallen. Only one major power in Western Europe remained unconquered. Across the English Channel, Britain now stood alone, and soon the battle for the skies would begin. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled much of continental Europe. Poland had fallen. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France had all been defeated. Only one major power remained unconquered. Britain stood alone. Adolf Hitler believed that before Germany could invade Britain, it first had to gain control of the skies. The success of any invasion depended on defeating the Royal Air Force, RAF. Without air superiority, crossing the English Channel would be an enormous risk. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. It became the first major military campaign fought almost entirely in the air. The German Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, launched relentless attacks against British shipping, airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, and military infrastructure. Their objective was clear: destroy the RAF and open the way for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion of Britain. The RAF, however, proved far more resilient than German planners had expected. Flying aircraft such as the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, British and Allied pilots met wave after wave of incoming bombers and fighter escorts. Although they were often outnumbered, they fought with remarkable determination. One of Britain's greatest advantages was its chain-home radar network. Combined with an efficient command and control system, radar allowed the RAF to detect incoming raids and direct fighter squadrons where they were needed most. It gave Britain precious minutes to prepare before German aircraft reached the coast. As the battle continued, Germany shifted its strategy. After several bombing raids struck Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to focus increasingly on London and other major cities. Beginning in September 1940, sustained bombing campaigns, known as the Blitz, inflicted widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties. Night after night, homes, factories, railways, and historic landmarks were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of civilians were killed, while many more sought shelter in underground stations and public bunkers.
Despite the devastation, daily life continued, and public morale remained remarkably resilient.
The change in German strategy also gave the RAF valuable time to rebuild its airfields, repair damaged aircraft, and replace exhausted pilots. Gradually, Germany's opportunity to gain air superiority began to fade. On September 15, 1940, the RAF inflicted heavy losses on attacking German formations in one of the battle's decisive engagements. Historians often regard the day as a turning point in the campaign.
By the end of October 1940, it had become clear that Germany had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Plans for Operation Sea Lion were indefinitely postponed. For the first time since the war had begun, Hitler had suffered a major strategic setback. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later paid tribute to the RAF with words that became famous around the world.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. It proved that Hitler's military machine was not invincible, and ensured that Britain would remain a base for the Allied war effort in the years ahead. The skies over Britain had been defended, but Hitler now turned his attention eastward, toward an even greater and more devastating campaign.
The skies over Britain had been defended, but Hitler now turned his attention eastward, toward the Soviet Union. Despite signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, Adolf Hitler had never intended to maintain a lasting peace with the Soviet Union. He viewed the agreement as a temporary measure, while Germany secured its position in Western Europe. His long-term objective remained the conquest of vast territories in the east, for what the Nazi regime called Lebensraum, or living space.
At dawn on June the 22nd, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. More than 3 million Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles and horses, crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 2,900 kilometers. The invasion was divided into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, the Soviet capital. Army Group South pushed into the fertile lands of Ukraine, seeking both agricultural resources and industrial centers.
The attack caught the Soviet Union largely by surprise. Although intelligence reports had warned of a possible invasion, Joseph Stalin believed Germany was unlikely to strike before defeating Britain. As a result, many Soviet units were unprepared when the assault began. German forces advanced with astonishing speed. Once again, Blitzkrieg combined armored divisions, motorized infantry, artillery, and air power into a devastating offensive. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded in vast encirclement battles near Bialystok-Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Yet, despite these enormous losses, Soviet resistance did not collapse.
As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the Red Army continued to raise new formations. Factories were dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, where they resumed production beyond the reach of most German bombers. Across the country, civilians and soldiers alike prepared for a long and desperate struggle. Meanwhile, retreating Soviet forces adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying railways, bridges, crops, fuel supplies, and infrastructure that might aid the advancing German army. Every kilometer gained came at an increasing logistical cost.
By the autumn of 1941,
German troops stood within striking distance of Moscow. Many believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was only a matter of time. But Germany had underestimated both the vastness of the Soviet Union and the determination of its people. As temperatures fell and supply lines stretched to their limits, the offensive began to slow. Roads turned to deep mud during the Rasputitsa, and soon one of the harshest winters in decades descended upon the battlefield.
The rapid victory Hitler had expected was slipping away. The road to Moscow was still open. But winter and Soviet resistance were about to change the course of the war. The road to Moscow was still open, but winter and Soviet resistance were about to change the course of the war. By the autumn of 1941, German forces had advanced farther into the Soviet Union than many military planners had thought possible. After months of rapid victories, Hitler believed that one final offensive against Moscow would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. The operation, known as Operation Typhoon, began in late September 1941. Its objective was clear: capture the Soviet capital before winter arrived and force the collapse of Soviet resistance. At first, the offensive appeared successful. German armored divisions surrounded large Soviet forces near Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The road to Moscow seemed increasingly open. But as the German army pushed eastward, its greatest enemy was no longer the Red Army alone. Autumn rains transformed unpaved roads into deep fields of mud during the Rasputitsa. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and supply convoys struggled to move. Fuel, ammunition, food, and winter clothing often failed to reach the front lines. Every kilometer gained placed greater strain on Germany's already overstretched supply system. By November, temperatures dropped sharply. Soon, one of the coldest winters in decades swept across the battlefield. Many German soldiers had expected the campaign to end before winter and were not fully equipped for the freezing conditions. Weapons malfunctioned, engines froze, and frostbite became a growing threat. Meanwhile, Moscow prepared for its defense. Thousands of civilians dug anti-tank trenches, built defensive fortifications, and worked around the clock to strengthen the city's outer defenses. Factories continued producing weapons, while Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia after intelligence indicated that Japan was unlikely to launch an attack in the Far East. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army organized a determined defense of the capital. As exhausted German forces approached the outskirts of Moscow, fierce fighting erupted across the surrounding region. In some sectors, German advance units came within sight of the distant skyline of Moscow, yet they could go no farther. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, trained and equipped for winter warfare, pushed the exhausted German army back from the capital. For the first time in the war, Germany was forced into a large-scale retreat on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Moscow shattered Hitler's expectation of a quick victory over the Soviet Union. The war in the East would not end in months. It would become a long and brutal struggle of endurance. Although Germany remained a formidable military power, the myth of its unstoppable advance had been broken. As fighting raged across the frozen Eastern Front, another event, thousands of kilometers away, would transform the war into a truly global conflict. As fighting raged across the frozen Eastern Front, another event, thousands of kilometers away, would transform the war into a truly global conflict. For more than 2 years,
the United States had remained officially neutral. Although President Franklin D. Roosevelt strongly supported the Allied nations through programs such as Lend-Lease, most Americans were still reluctant to enter another global war. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and the Empire of Japan continued to grow. Japan had expanded aggressively across East Asia, occupying large parts of China and later moving into French Indochina. In response, the United States imposed economic sanctions, including an embargo on oil exports, resources Japan considered essential for its military ambitions.
Japanese leaders believed that if war became unavoidable, they had to strike first. Their objective was to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet, preventing it from interfering with Japan's planned expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. On the morning of December 7, 1941, without a declaration of war, more than 350 Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
Within less than 2 hours, battleships were sunk or severely damaged, airfields were devastated, and hundreds of American aircraft were destroyed or disabled. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, while over 1,000 were wounded. Despite the scale of the attack, Japan failed to destroy several critical targets. American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor that morning, and key fuel storage facilities and repair docks survived largely intact. These omissions would prove significant in the months ahead.
The following day, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed the United States Congress with words that would become part of history. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Congress overwhelmingly approved a declaration of war against Japan. Only days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their obligations under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. America responded by declaring war on both nations.
The conflict that had begun in Europe was now truly global. Across the world, factories accelerated production. Millions volunteered or were drafted into military service, and the industrial strength of the United States began transforming into one of the greatest war efforts in history. The balance of the war had changed forever. While Japan advanced rapidly across the Pacific, the Allies prepared for a long struggle that would determine the future of 2 oceans and the world itself.
While Japan advanced rapidly across the Pacific, the Allies prepared for a long struggle that would determine the future of 2 oceans and the world itself. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a series of coordinated offensives across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Within months, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and large parts of Burma, creating one of the largest empires in modern history.
The speed of Japan's advance shocked the world. Allied forces, many of them poorly prepared for the rapid offensive, struggled to halt the momentum. By early 1942, Japan appeared nearly unstoppable. But the tide of war was about to change. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea became the first naval battle in history in which opposing fleets never saw one another directly. Aircraft launched from aircraft carriers fought the battle almost entirely from the air. Although both sides suffered losses, Japan's advance toward Port Moresby was halted, marking the first strategic setback of its Pacific campaign.
Only a month later came one of the most decisive naval battles of the Second World War. Between June 4th and June 7th, 1942, American and Japanese forces clashed at the Battle of Midway. Thanks in part to American codebreakers, who had successfully deciphered key elements of Japan's naval communications, the United States anticipated the attack and prepared an ambush. In just a few hours, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, while losing only one carrier, USS Yorktown.
When the campaign ended in February 1943, Japan had suffered heavy losses and was forced to abandon the island. It was the first major Allied offensive to permanently seize territory from Japanese control. From that point forward, the United States adopted an island-hopping strategy. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, Allied forces bypassed heavily defended positions, captured strategically important islands, and established new airfields and naval bases. Isolated Japanese garrisons were left cut off from supplies and reinforcements.
Slowly but steadily, Allied forces moved closer to Japan itself. The empire that had expanded with breathtaking speed now found itself fighting a defensive war across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Pacific was turning against Japan. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history.
The Pacific was turning against Japan. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. By 1944, the course of the war had begun to shift. In the east, the Soviet Union was steadily pushing German forces back after victories at Stalingrad and Kursk. In the west, Britain and the United States prepared to open a long-awaited second front against Nazi Germany. The operation was given the codename Operation Overlord. Its objective was ambitious: land Allied armies in Normandy, establish a secure foothold in France, and begin the liberation of Western Europe.
To protect the invasion, the Allies launched one of the most successful deception campaigns in military history. Through Operation Fortitude, they created fake armies, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, and double agents to convince German commanders that the invasion would take place at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The deception worked. Even as the invasion began, many German leaders believed Normandy was only a diversion.
Before dawn, on June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. Their mission was to capture bridges, secure key road junctions, and disrupt German communications before the main landings began. A few hours later, an enormous Allied fleet crossed the English Channel. More than 156,000 Allied soldiers, supported by nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft and over 11,000 aircraft, arrived on the coast of Normandy. Never before had such a massive amphibious operation been attempted.
The landings took place across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Resistance varied from beach to beach. At Utah Beach, American forces achieved many of their objectives, despite landing slightly off target. British and Canadian troops fought determined battles at Gold, Juneau, and Sword, gradually pushing inland against German defenses. But at Omaha Beach, the invasion came dangerously close to failure.
German machine gun positions overlooking the bluffs inflicted devastating casualties on the first waves of American troops. Landing craft were destroyed, communications broke down, and many soldiers found themselves pinned down under relentless fire. Despite the chaos, small groups of soldiers fought their way up the cliffs, bypassed fortified positions, and slowly opened paths for the forces behind them. By the end of the day, the beachhead had been secured, but at a tremendous cost. Over the following weeks, hundreds of thousands of additional Allied troops, vehicles and supplies poured into Normandy. Fierce fighting continued through the hedgerows of northern France as the Allies gradually expanded their foothold. In August 1944, Paris was liberated after more than 4 years of German occupation. Crowds filled the streets as Allied soldiers entered the French capital, marking one of the most symbolic victories of the war.
D-Day did not end the Second World War, but it marked the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's occupation of Western Europe. As Allied armies advanced from the west and Soviet forces closed in from the east, Germany found itself trapped in a war it could no longer win. As Allied armies advanced from the west and Soviet forces closed in from the east, Germany found itself trapped in a war it could no longer win. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. In the west, Allied forces pushed steadily through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In the east, the Red Army continued its relentless advance after a series of major victories. Desperate to regain the initiative, Hitler launched one final major offensive in the west.
In December 1944, German forces attacked through the dense Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The operation became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. At first, the surprise attack caught Allied commanders off guard. German troops created a large bulge in the Allied front line, hoping to split British and American forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. But fierce Allied resistance, determined American defenders at Bastogne, and worsening shortages of fuel and supplies gradually brought the German offensive to a halt. By January 1945, the attack had failed. Germany had exhausted many of its remaining experienced soldiers, tanks, and aircraft, losses it could no longer replace. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, advancing hundreds of kilometers in only a few weeks. By early 1945, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The German capital now stood directly in the path of the advancing Red Army. As Allied bombers continued striking Germany's industrial centers, transportation networks, and oil facilities, the country's ability to continue the war steadily collapsed. Cities lay in ruins, factories struggled to produce weapons, and civilian life grew increasingly desperate. In April 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. Soviet forces surrounded the city, while intense street fighting erupted among shattered buildings and burning neighborhoods. German soldiers, foreign volunteers, and members of the Volkssturm, a militia made up of teenage boys and older men, fought desperately as the city's defenses crumbled.
Deep beneath Berlin, inside the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops only a short distance away, Hitler died by suicide in the bunker. His death marked the collapse of the regime that had plunged Europe into 6 years of devastating war. Only days later, on May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The surrender took effect on May 8th, celebrated across Europe as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. After nearly 6 years of conflict, the war in Europe had finally come to an end. But the Second World War was not yet over. Across the Pacific, Japan continued to fight, and the final chapter of the war was about to unfold.
Across the Pacific, Japan continued to fight, and history was about to witness one of its most controversial and devastating decisions. Although Nazi Germany had surrendered in May 1945, the war in Asia continued with relentless intensity. Japanese forces resisted fiercely across the Pacific, and battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the enormous human cost of invading territory defended by the Imperial Japanese military.
At Okinawa, which ended in June 1945, more than 200,000 people, including soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. The battle convinced many Allied leaders that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands could result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. Meanwhile, a secret American research program known as the Manhattan Project had successfully developed the world's first atomic weapons. Led by thousands of scientists, engineers, and military personnel, the project introduced a technology unlike anything humanity had ever seen. After Germany's surrender, Allied leaders called upon Japan to surrender unconditionally. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration warned that if Japan refused, it would face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government did not accept the declaration. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima.
In an instant, much of the city was destroyed. The blast, intense heat and radiation killed tens of thousands of people immediately. By the end of 1945, an estimated 140,000 people had died as a result of the bombing and its effects. Many of the survivors suffered severe burns, radiation sickness, and long-term health complications. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Although the city's geography reduced some of the blast's impact, the destruction remained immense. By the end of 1945, approximately 70,000 people had died from the bombing and its aftermath.
On August 8, 1945, between the two atomic bombings, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria. The rapid Soviet advance further weakened Japan's strategic position. Faced with the combined impact of the atomic bombings and the Soviet declaration of war, Japan's leadership concluded that continued resistance was no longer sustainable. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms in a historic radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice.
The formal surrender was signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. After 6 years of global conflict, the Second World War had finally come to an end. Yet the war left behind difficult questions that historians continue to debate. The decision to use atomic bombs remains one of the most controversial subjects in modern history, with ongoing discussions about military necessity, diplomacy, ethics, and the immense human suffering they caused. The guns had finally fallen silent, but the world they left behind had been changed forever. The guns had finally fallen silent, but the world they left behind had been changed forever. The Second World War officially ended in 1945, but its consequences would shape international politics, technology, and human society for generations to come. More than 60 million people had lost their lives, making World War II the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions of families had been displaced,
and countless survivors carried physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime.
Across Europe and Asia, nations faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding. Roads, bridges, railways, factories, and homes had been destroyed on an unimaginable scale. Recovery would take years, and in many places, decades. The war also exposed the horrifying reality of the Holocaust, in which Nazi Germany systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, along with millions of other victims, including Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others targeted by the Nazi regime. The world was forced to confront one of history's greatest crimes against humanity.
In response, the Nuremberg trials brought leading Nazi officials before an international tribunal. For the first time, individuals were held personally accountable for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. The trials established legal principles that continue to influence international law today. Determined to prevent another global catastrophe, 50 nations came together in October 1945 to establish the United Nations. Its mission was to promote international cooperation, resolve conflicts peacefully, and protect future generations from the devastation of another world war. Yet peace brought new tensions.
The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly gave way to political rivalry and ideological conflict. Europe became divided between East and West, marking the beginning of the Cold War, a decades-long struggle that would dominate global affairs for nearly half a century. World War II also accelerated remarkable advances in science and technology. Radar, jet aircraft, antibiotics, rocketry, computing, and nuclear technology all developed rapidly during the conflict, transforming both military capabilities and civilian life in the decades that followed. The war reshaped the global balance of power. European colonial empires gradually weakened, while the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant superpowers. The world of 1945 was profoundly different from the world of 1939. The Second World War was not merely a conflict between armies. It was a struggle that transformed nations, redefined international relations, and forever changed the course of human history. Its lessons would continue to influence the world long after the final battle had ended.
Every generation inherits the lessons of history. Few events have shaped the modern world more profoundly than the Second World War. It was a conflict born from hatred, ambition, fear, and political failure. It consumed continents, destroyed civilizations, and claimed the lives of more than 60 million people. Behind every battlefield was a human story. A soldier who never returned home. A child searching for family among the ruins. A mother waiting for a letter that would never arrive. And millions of ordinary people. And millions of ordinary people whose lives were changed forever by a war they did not choose. Yet even in humanity's darkest hours, courage endured. Soldiers fought with extraordinary determination. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save lives. Resistance movements risked everything for freedom. Families rebuilt their homes, their communities, and their hopes from the ashes of war. The Second World War reminds us that peace is never guaranteed. Freedom, democracy, and human dignity must be protected by every generation. The choices of leaders can shape the destiny of nations, but the choices of ordinary people can shape the future of humanity.
More than 80 years have passed since the guns fell silent, yet the lessons of World War II remain as important today as they were in 1945. Its story is not only about war, it is about courage in the face of fear, hope in the midst of destruction, and the enduring belief that even after humanity's darkest chapters, a better future can still be built. The Second World War has come to an end, but its lessons continue to echo across the world. Because history is not only something we remember,